When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. At American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.
This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. We try and make sure that that you learn something, you're entertained. We think teach and entertain. Some days we're better at it than others. We're joined today by David Pivnick. David's a brilliant partner, leader in litigation at McGuire Woods, does a lot of work at the intersection of private equity and litigation. Big and interesting disputes and files and cases. Often with David and I, we go off on tangents sometimes. David, we had done a podcast yesterday on, 5 things that still suck. And a couple things that we had talked about were parts of where ChatGPT is useful, parts where it's not. We talked about leadership at some major companies that are really struggling. One of those being, Chrysler, Jeep. We've also talked recently about the challenges at Intel, but we've also talked about the fact, in terms of 5 things that still suck, we're at a spot where in the Chicago sports landscape, when the Bears were 4-2, I said to you, it looks like we've really solved the problem. You literally laughed at me, and you laughed correctly because they've gone on to lose 7 in a row. But we're sort of in this barren landscape. There are 5 pro teams in Chicago, and I didn't mention our soccer team, and I should mention our WNBA team. There's probably 7 when you talk about that. But from the legacy historic sports, there's 5 to start with, and then we'll get into soccer and the WNBA as well. But of the 5 legacy sports teams, the Chicago Bears are 4-9. The Bulls are 10-15 or something like that. The Blackhawks are 9-17. The Cubs are the only one of the 5 with a winning record. And the White Sox this past year set the record for the most losses in the modern era. Our mayor of Chicago also is horrible. Really a tangent there. But how does this happen that one city ends up with so many bad sports teams? How does that actually happen? How does that happen? A sense of that. I mean, and you could add to the list of things that suck. I'm happy to hear you do them. It's not a mature topic, but I am amazed at how you get so mediocre in sports for so long with so many teams. How is that possible? There's like nothing to cheer for. There's nothing that's positive on the horizon in terms of Chicago sports.
Yeah, no, it really is kind of staggering. I mean, first of all, I was shocked. The Bears have lost 7 in a row. I lost track as they kept losing games, and fascinating to hear that it's reached 7. And after all the hope and optimism you had, it must be truly devastating for you. But, Chicago sports, it's interesting because you would think with that many teams, we'd have at least one that wasn't utterly incompetent. And I think the Blackhawks are the one. They're bad this year, but there's cause for optimism. The rest, it's a little gloomier, and it's odd how long and storied the futility has been. Like the White Sox and Cubs, they both have a World Series in the 2000s, which is great, and more than can be said for my Blue Jays. But prior to those respective World Series wins, they were both, battling century-old demons. The Blackhawks have had recent success, in the very recent past, and won 3 cups in 6 years. And at least they are justifiably in what is a full-fledged teardown and rebuild. And as I said, I'm a big believer in Connor Bedard. I'm thrilled Kevin Korchinski's back on the ice, and Frank Nazar is coming up, and his first game will be tomorrow. And I have huge expectations for him as well. So the Blackhawks have at least done a full teardown and are rebuilding from the studs, and I think are doing it appropriately. They have a lot of cap space. They have a lot of depth in the farm system. I think Kyle Davidson is a competent GM, and that might be the difference and the common thread with the other teams. Is Chicago's a big market. It's got significant dollars in the seats and trying to sell luxury suites and tickets. And I think most of the other teams in the city have been generally incredibly reluctant to just tear everything down and start anew, accepting that it's going to be a multi-year process with a fair amount of futility in the meantime, and that you have to sort of live with that, plug your nose, and get over it. The Cubs, frankly, did that fairly well, leading to the 2016 World Series and putting together a team that could compete. And as much as I ridicule the Bears because they're obviously pathetic, they do have the makings of a decent core with their recent draft picks. And I credit Ryan Poles truly. I think he's made some mistakes, but I credit the fact that he's done a good job leveraging his draft assets, maximizing the trade of the first overall pick last year, and accumulating draft picks so that they have a fair amount of young talent. And if they continue to build smartly, they could actually be good in a couple of years. Like, who knows? They might win 8 games and barely miss the playoffs instead of finishing last.
Let me ask you a question, because a few moments ago you had mentioned that you're a Toronto Blue Jays fan, which is a Canadian sports team, and I just wanted to comment that nobody cares about the Canadian sports team. So you don't need to bring that up. Nobody cares. It's irrelevant. Nobody cares.
There's a strong contingent of Canadian listeners to the Becker Private Equity Podcast. I respectfully disagree with that assertion.
If there are Canadian listeners, you're welcome to stay on, but you don't have to. Your sponsorship dollars are not important. No, we're kidding about that. We're kidding. We're joking. We love our Canadian brethren to the north. And since the Montreal Alouettes, I have not cheered for. I actually was a huge Canadian fan as a child, as a kid. So talk about this for a second. The Blackhawks, they spent so much money this offseason to buy sort of talented, almost journeyman players to try and fill gaps in the meantime. I've never seen a coach do a poorer job of trying to make the most out of Connor Bedard's potential than Luke Richardson did. And I think we're going to bring this analogous back to different businesses, because even although Caleb Williams is stuck in a horrible coaching situation, he set all the Bears records already for rookie quarterbacks, which is a statement both about his talent and also about the historic Bears failures at quarterback. But somehow or another, they've not gotten in the way as much as they could have with his raw talent. Ryan Poles, to your point, stacked receivers around him, and they got a coach in their hands who's got to make decisions quickly, and he's unbelievable, quite frankly. Connor Bedard's getting stuck on lines and just in a horrible situation. How does that happen? And then maybe I could try and bring this back to business, where people haven't constructed teams well. They're not managing teams well. They've not developed the depth they need to build and stuff like that. But before we get to trying to make this into a serious connectivity and a useful connectivity to business, talk about how poorly Connor Bedard has been used this year and how they've managed to screw up his opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things that I think are key differences that do have a practical explanation. On Caleb Williams, I mean, one, without even making a joke, you alluded to it. I mean, the Bears have had such an atrocious, abominably bad history at the quarterback position that I'm pretty sure when Caleb Williams threw his first pass this year, he already held all of the Bears' rookie quarterback records. So one of the things is just it's such a low bar for him to surpass that he was naturally going to get there because he literally couldn't help but get there. The other benefit is by losing 7 games in a row and playing on a bad team, you're constantly playing from behind, which means he's doing nothing but throw the ball. So when you throw it 50 times a game, you're going to have more chances. And having gone to the Bears games at home against the Vikings, followed up by the Thanksgiving Day game in Detroit, they were down significantly at the half in each of those games. And then they sort of unleashed Caleb in the second half. And I do think truly it gives cause for optimism for Bears fans, because when he was unleashed to throw it around the field, he did a pretty confident job of it and was able to put up some numbers. So being behind enabled it. Connor Bedard has the opposite situation. You don't change to something that's more sort of free-flowing in hockey where you're just throwing the ball in football. And worse than that, because Connor Bedard is not only the Blackhawks' best player by a pretty significant, massive margin, but he is also the focal point of every other team we play against defense. And so he's always matched up against the toughest defense pairing and the toughest forward lines every game. He's still working on his, game up and down the ice. His offensive game is terrific, but he's still working on playing a 200-foot game, and his face-off, he needs to be better in the face-off circle. But because he's constantly getting matched up against the opponent's best players, and we don't have enough complementary talent around him to force other teams to take other guys seriously, the deck is kind of stacked against him. And so I do think having guys like Korchinski and Nazar up is really going to help Connor Bedard, because even when he's not on the ice with those guys, the mere fact that other teams have to game plan for multiple young, talented, creative players is going to open up opportunities. So I'm underwhelmed with what the Blackhawks have looked like this year, but I was still fully of the mindset coming into the year that it was a rebuilding season. I thought it would be a little less painful than last year, and that hasn't proven to be true.
But let me ask you a question, because, you're not as complex or sophisticated as I am, and I have coached house league hockey. And so anybody who's ever coached house league hockey, and I take it there's probably some people in our audience that have been involved in this house league hockey, and this is different than your kids playing in the all-star program and stuff like that. But if you coach house league hockey, there's a vast array of talent from the lowest line to kids that can barely skate, depending on what age group you're in. And there's something called stacking lines. And what you're supposed to do in house league hockey is your best players playing your first line, your second best players in your second line, third best players playing your third lines. And what you learn in house league hockey early on is that in every year, every league, there's a few coaches that totally throw that out, and they'll put their best player on the third line, and that kid will have 100 goals because he's playing against people that can barely skate. Isn't there an ability to move around what line Connor plays on or who he plays with to get him more opportunities? Not to bring us back to the vaunted strategy of stacking the lines, but is there no ability to move around? Or is the point that you're making, as I'm learning and listening, quite frankly, Dave is one of the smartest people I know. I joke, but he's actually one of the smartest people I know. But you alluded to this. There's just not enough talent on the team in whole. It's not just his line mates. There's no ability to get him on periodically a different line, so he's not always playing the best talent on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, they've rotated his lines repeatedly. He actually practiced at yesterday's skate with Ilya Bikayev, who's been on the third and fourth line all year and really doesn't have a great offensive game, but frankly is one of the fastest guys on the team. So, new coach Andrew Sorensen is trying to mix it up. But the short answer is there just isn't enough high-end first and second line talent on the current roster. Teuvo Teravainen is a solid player, and he seemed to click with Connor Bedard the first couple of weeks of the year, and then that kind of fell off. Taylor Hall had a real rough start to the season. He's been much better the last few weeks, and I think the talent is in there, but hasn't been great. Tyler Bertuzzi, I thought, was a good signing. I liked it in the summer, in the offseason. He just hasn't produced at 5-on-5 all season. So the short answer is they've got a lot of guys who are more middle six forwards than elite top-line talent, which makes it hard for Connor Bedard. And then on top of that, whoever he's playing with, he's going to be the matchup that the other team worries about. And there's no one else that's close to moving the needle on that front that other teams have to sort of keep an eye on to keep them honest as they do their defensive game plan.
No, that makes a lot of sense as you explained it. It's really fascinating. I mean, I see it across. I will bring this back to business for a second. I see it in the depth of companies, the depth of firms, when they've got enough talent, they can approach and go after a lot of different opportunities. People always talk about this adage, culture eats strategy for lunch or for breakfast or whatever it is. The reality is culture's great, but you better have talent as well. And we see it in companies. I've served on the board. I've served on the board of several companies. But some companies stack a lot of talent, and they're able to go a lot further and do a lot more things than companies that don't. So at the end of the day, you both need a CEO and a leader that knows what they're doing, that can coach, that can manage, that can work it, and you need enough talent around that person so you could really do great things. And so it seems like the Hawks still have a talent deficit that's getting better. And they seem to have had a coaching deficit. I couldn't quite figure out the last several coaches. I mean, obviously, Joe Quenneville, who left under a cloud, was one of the great NHL coaches of all time, but some other scandals in that locker room. And the Bears, I don't remember the last time they've had a real coach, but hopefully, they'll figure that out. And the Bulls seem a little bit hapless at the moment. I like their coach. They need more talent. Oh, goodness, it is difficult to watch as a Chicago sports fan. So, again, on the subject of things that suck or things that still stink, I appreciate David Pivnick indulging me in talking Chicago sports teams. Chanel, we'll come up with a title for this episode. I hope people enjoy it. I know it's a little ridiculous, but great fun, and I hope you enjoy the episode. I always enjoy talking to David Pivnick, and even though he is Canadian, even though he is what he is, he's one of the brightest, best lawyers that I know, and one of the most talented people I know. So it's always great to visit with him. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.